There is a specific kind of strange that has nothing to do with the supernatural. It doesn't involve anything breaking the laws of physics. Nobody levitated. The course didn't rearrange itself. The leaderboard functioned exactly as leaderboards function, updating its numbers with the cold, impartial efficiency it always does. Everything looked, to a camera pointed at it, completely normal. And yet, the caddy noticed it first, around the fifth hole, though he wouldn't be able to say precisely when. He noticed that something in the air between himself and his player had changed texture, that the rhythm of their communication, which after 11 years together he can read the way a musician reads a sheet of music, was producing notes he hadn't heard before. Not wrong notes. Not bad ones. Something stranger than either of those things. Notes he couldn't quite name. By the ninth hole, 3 other caddies walking adjacent fairways had exchanged glances with each other. The particular glance of professionals who have spent enough time around this sport to recognize when something is happening that doesn't have an obvious category. By the 15th, the broadcast team had stopped trying to describe it in the usual language and had settled, slightly uncomfortably, into simply observing, which is not something broadcast teams do naturally. Observation without commentary is, for them, a kind of admission. An admission that what was happening on that golf course today was not something their vocabulary had been built to handle. This is the story of what it was. He is not, by the conventional metrics of PGA Tour storytelling, an obvious subject for a documentary. He has wins, 3 of them, spread across 8 years, which is enough to establish a career, but not enough to generate mythology. His ranking places him in the solid middle of a field where the solid middle is occupied by some of the most technically accomplished golfers in the world. He gives good interviews in the sense that his answers are thoughtful and his sentences are complete. He gives unremarkable interviews in the sense that he has never, to anyone's recollection, said anything that caused a journalist to set down their coffee. He is, in short, a professional. In all the ways that word implies. Competent, prepared, reliable, and slightly invisible in the way that reliable things tend to become invisible once you've stopped worrying about them. Which makes what happened today strange in a way that goes beyond the events themselves. Because strange things, when they happen to obvious subjects, the flamboyant personalities, the players whose emotional range is already visible from the gallery ropes, can be accommodated within the existing narrative. They fit. They extend a story that was already being told. Strange things happening to a man who has spent 8 years being carefully, professionally unremarkable are strange in a different, more disorienting way. They don't extend a story. They start one. And starting a story, when no one was expecting a story to begin, is a more unsettling experience for everyone involved than continuing a familiar one. He arrived at the course this morning the way he always arrives. Early, methodical, self-contained. His caddy met him at the range. They went through the standard pre-round routine, distances, wind tendencies for the day, a brief discussion of the 2 or 3 holes that require a specific game plan rather than a standard approach. The conversation was the conversation they always have. Nothing in it suggested the day ahead. And then he stepped onto the first tee. And the strangeness, whatever it was, began. The strangeness was not, to be absolutely clear, a strangeness of performance. His opening holes were good. Birdie on 2, par on 3 and 4, a bogey on 5 that he made back immediately on 6 with a recovery chip that the broadcast team described as instinctive, and that his caddy would later describe as the first time I really felt it, whatever it was. What the caddy felt, and what he would struggle to articulate for the rest of the day and into the evening, was a quality in his player's presence that he didn't have a clean word for. Not confidence. He'd seen confidence before, knew what it looked like in this particular person on this particular face. Not the absence of nerves. That's a different thing entirely, and it was clearly not that. Something else. Something that sat between concentration and surrender in a way that made the caddy's job feel, for the first time in years, unnecessary. As if his player was operating from a place so interior and complete that the external infrastructure of a caddy, the yardages, the wind reads, the shoulder tap of reassurance, was being received politely, but not actually required. He was somewhere I couldn't follow, the caddy said later, searching for it. I was still outside the shot. He was already inside it before I finished the sentence. The broadcast team picked it up differently. What they noticed, what the data later confirmed, was a pace of decision-making that was subtly, measurably faster than his career average. Not rushed. Faster is not the same as rushed. Rushed is the product of anxiety accelerating a process. What he was doing was the product of something that had removed a step from the process entirely. The deliberation step. The step where the mind reviews and second-guesses and reconsiders and finally, reluctantly, commits. That step was absent. He was arriving at commitment without passing through uncertainty. On the 8th hole, he hit a shot that a tour veteran watching from behind the gallery ropes, someone who has played in 4 Ryder Cups and has been around professional golf for 25 years, turned to the person beside him and said, quietly, "Where did that come from?" Not meaning, that was an unusual distance, or that was an atypical club selection, or that was a surprising trajectory. Meaning something closer to, who was hitting that shot? Because the player standing over it looked like the man they all knew. But the shot that resulted looked like it had been produced by someone who had been playing this game in a different dimension and had just briefly crossed over. The person beside him had no answer. Neither did anyone else. Through the middle stretch of the round, holes 9 through 14, something happened that made the strangeness more, not less, strange. He began to be aware of it. This is where the account becomes delicate. Because awareness, in sport, is almost always the thing that ends the state it's observing. The moment a player becomes conscious of being in the zone is, classically, the moment the zone starts closing. Consciousness and that particular quality of unconscious freedom are, in the usual logic of athletic performance, incompatible. You cannot watch yourself doing the thing and keep doing the thing. Not simultaneously. Not for long. He became aware somewhere around the 10th hole. He would say so afterward with the specific candor of someone who has had time to examine the experience from a slight distance. "I noticed I was noticing," was the phrase he used, acknowledging the strange recursion of it. Aware that he was in something unusual. Aware that being aware of it was the conventional prelude to losing it. And then, and this is the strange part, the genuinely unprecedented part for him personally, not losing it. "I kept waiting for it to go," he said. "The way it always does. And it didn't. And then I started wondering if the reason it wasn't going was because I wasn't fighting the awareness. I was just letting the awareness be there too. Inside the same space." His caddy noticed the shift in his noticing. Noticed that his player, around the 11th hole, began looking at him differently between shots, not for information, but with something that resembled quiet wonder. The expression of a person who is experiencing something they didn't expect and isn't sure whether trying to understand it will help or harm it. The caddy, for perhaps the first time in 11 years, found himself just watching. Not caddying, not managing, watching. Because what was happening in front of him felt less like a round of golf and more like a demonstration of something. He couldn't have told you what, only that it felt important in a way that yardages and wind reads were not equipped to address. Holes 10 through 14, 4 birdies, 1 par. Not the numbers of a collapse. The numbers of someone who had turned whatever was happening into fuel rather than distraction. The broadcast team, by hole 12, had stopped trying to contextualize and had simply started describing. Shot by shot, hole by hole, without the scaffolding of narrative analysis or historical comparison. Just, here is what is happening. Watch. 15 is where it crystallized. Where the round stopped being an interesting anomaly and became something else. Something the people present would find themselves returning to in conversation for weeks, not because of what it produced on the scorecard, but because of what it felt like to be inside it. His approach to 15 was from an awkward lie, left rough, 211 yards to a green that, at this distance, from this position, most players would approach with a strategy built around missing in the right place. The smart play was a safe play. The safe play was widely understood, widely endorsed, available to him as obviously as it was to everyone watching. He didn't consult his caddy. For the first time all round, possibly the first time in months, he stood over the ball without the intermediary conversation. He looked at the green. He looked at the ball. He selected a club that several watching players, if they'd been asked, would have said was too much. And he hit a shot that landed on the green and stopped inside 8 feet. His caddy, standing behind him, made no sound. He told a colleague later that he'd opened his mouth and then closed it again, because whatever he might have said, any expression of admiration, any release of the tension he'd been quietly managing all day, felt like it would be an interruption. That the moment belonged entirely to his player and to whatever had been accompanying his player since the first tee, and inserting his voice into it would be a kind of trespass. He made the putt, 6 under through 15, in a tournament he'd arrived at as a midfield presence. And the gallery at 15, which had grown, hole by hole, as word moved through the course in the way that word moves when something is happening that people feel they should witness, stood in something that wasn't quite silence and wasn't quite noise. The particular suspended collective state of several hundred people who are present for something they recognize as significant and haven't yet agreed on how to respond to. His playing partner, a veteran of 11 tour wins who has seen most of what professional golf produces, turned to his own caddy on the walk to 16 and said 4 words. "What is happening today?" His caddy had no answer, which, from a man who has an answer for almost everything, said everything. He finished at 7 under. It placed him near the top of the leaderboard in a tournament he had entered with modest expectations and departed as something harder to categorize. Not a winner, not yet. There were still players on the course when he finished, still scores being made and unmade in the afternoon heat, but in a position that would require serious attention from everyone above him. In a position he had not occupied, by his own accounting, in over 2 years. In the scoring tent, signing his card in the careful, methodical way that professional athletes sign important documents, checking each number twice, because the score you sign is the score you're responsible for regardless of what you intended. He was asked by a tournament volunteer, making conversation, how his round had felt. He looked up from the card, considered the question with what the volunteer would later describe as unusual seriousness, the seriousness of someone who has been waiting for someone to ask. "Strange," he said, in the best possible way. "Like I showed up and someone else was already there. Someone who knew exactly what to do. And I just got out of their way." The volunteer didn't know quite what to do with this answer. She nodded and thanked him, and he finished signing the card and left the tent. She stood there for a moment thinking about what he'd said. Someone who knew exactly what to do. And I just got out of their way. She would think about it again that evening, and the morning after. And she would discover, at odd intervals for a long time after, in the middle of her own work, in the moments between tasks when the mind wanders to the things it hasn't finished with. Not because it was a profound statement in any formal sense, but because it described something she recognized. Something about the relationship between effort and its opposite. About the version of yourself that becomes available when you stop insisting on managing it. Something strange happened during today's PGA Tour round. It wasn't a hole-in-one. It wasn't a comeback from 6 back with 9 to play. It wasn't a number on a leaderboard that rewrote expectations or a trophy being lifted in the late afternoon light. It was a man who, for one round, found the thing most players spend their entire careers looking for. And then, which may be the strangest part of all, recognized it clearly enough to describe it, quietly, in a scoring tent, to a volunteer who just asked how his round had felt, and name it for exactly what it was.